who enslaved us in the land of slavery. Tell your children about Joseph's brothers, how our own people sold us into the land of slavery. Tell your children about the folks who kept us, held us in the land of slavery. Tell your children about the difference between many Egyptian people and mean Egyptian policies and politics. Tell them the difference between nice Egyptian people and nasty Egyptian policies. The difference between some Egyptian folk and a sovereign Egyptian pharaoh. Tell them about the Egyptian slave drivers and the Egyptian taskmasters. Yes, don't ever let them forget that. But tell them also about Shifra and Puah, the Egyptian midwives who disobeyed the presidential kill list order, who went against the law, not the law of mass incarceration, but the law of male annihilation. 2 Egyptian midwives who refused to take the lives of black boys, but who chose to preserve the lives of black boys. Don't ever forget that part of the story. Tell your children about how we were forced to make bricks out of straw in the land of slavery, yes, but also tell your children about Joseph's Egyptian wife and Pharaoh's Egyptian daughter in the land of slavery. And for God's sake, do not forget to tell your children about the Lord who brought us out of the land of slavery. But I submit to you that we need to hear these instructions and heed that advice, or we too will end up like the people of Sumer, described in the opening pages of Dr. Chancellor Williams' classic study, The Destruction of Black Civilization. Williams writes, and I paraphrase, that a traveler in Africa encountered a wise old griot and asked him one day, whatever happened to the people of Sumer? Because the legend teaches us that they were black. What happened to them? The wise old man thought for a moment and then said, they forgot their story, and so they died. Any people who forget their story are a dead people. They cease to exist in the minds, the memories, and the histories of future generations. They forgot their story, and so they died. Tell your children their story. We need to first of all tell our children our story, and stop letting other folk tell our story for us. On Emancipation Day, we need to tell our children our story. Our story does not start in slavery. Dr. Bobby Wright, one of the founders of the Association of Black Psychologists, said if you keep starting to tell the history of your people and telling your story in 1619 in slavery, you will forever have a slave mentality. Our story does not start in slavery. Our story starts in Africa. Our story starts at the dawn of and in the cradle of civilization. Dr. Margaret Burroughs, for whom the Museum of African American History is named in Chicago. Dr. Burroughs and her awesome poem, What Shall I Tell My Children Who Are Black? Dr. Burroughs puts it this way, I have drunk deep of late from the fountain of my black culture, sat at the need of and learned from Mother Africa, discovered the truth of my heritage, the truth so often obscured and omitted, and I find I have much to say to my black children. I will lift up their heads in proud blackness with the story of their fathers and their fathers' fathers. And I shall take them into a way back time of kings and queens who ruled the Nile and measured the stars and discovered the laws of mathematics. I will tell them of a black people upon whose backs have been built the wealth of 3 continents. I will tell my black son, she said, this and more. And knowledge of his heritage shall be his weapon and his armor. Tell our children our story. Knowledge of his heritage will make him strong enough to win any battle he may face. And since this story is so often obscured, she says, I must sacrifice to find it for my children, even as I sacrifice to feed them, to clothe them, and to shelter them. So this I will do for them if I love them. None will do it before me. Margaret Burroughs. We need to tell our children our story. Our story does not start in slavery. A, our story does include, as Pastor said, a 244-year chapter of slavery, however. Then B, like Moses tells the elders, we need to tell our children how we were once enslaved. Our story. Y'all keep calling them slaves. No, those were Africans who were enslaved. In fact, the Association of Black Psychologists said they were never enslaved because to be enslaved, you have to give somebody that's trying to enslave you psychological assets to keep you enslaved. They were in bondage, but they weren't enslaved. They said, before I be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave. Dr. John Kennedy of the Virginia Union said the problem is our ancestors were in bondage. They were never enslaved. However, unfortunately, we are now free of bondage. And we are enslaved. We need to tell our children about the folks who enslaved us. Our story. The Africans who sold us, like Joseph's brothers sold him, in Ghana, in Benin, in Nigeria, in Senegal, in Cote d'Ivoire, and in Angola. The Africans who sold us, and the Europeans who bought us, and who brought us across the Atlantic into British and European colonies. Dr. L.H. Welcher, right here in Atlanta at ITC. Please pick up his book. The History and Heritage of the African American Church, and way out of nowhere. Welcher said, will you all stop calling the slave trade the transatlantic slave trade? The Atlantic ain't never put nobody in slavery. It's the European slave trade. We were brought to the colonies, the Spanish colonies of Cuba and Puerto Rico y Florida, the French colonies of Saint-Domingue, Martinique, Saint-Martin, and Haiti. Please don't ever forget to tell your children about Haiti, Boukman and Dessalines, the Dutch colonies of St. Croix and Aruba, the Portuguese colonies of Salvador Bahia, the home and birthplace of Candomblé and Palmares, the home of Zumbi and the largest Quilombo in the Black Atlantic, and the British colonies of the Bahamas, Jamaica, Trinidad, Tobago, St. Thomas, Turks and Caicos, New York, New Jersey, Maryland, Virginia. Tell them how slavery is at the foundation of Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and Stanford. Tell our children about the folks who enslaved us, our story, those who sold us, and those who bought us, those who kept us, those who held us, and those who helped us. Tell your children their story. Our story does not start in slavery. A, our story does have a 244-year-long chapter of slavery, yes. B, but our story, like the biblical story, does not end in slavery, which is what Emancipation Day is ultimately about. Our story, most importantly, has as its center a God who delivered us from slavery. Moses says, be careful that you do not forget the Lord who brought you out of slavery. Do not forget to tell your children about the God to whom enslaved Africans prayed. The God who heard their prayers, the God who answered their prayers, and the God whom they thanked when freedom finally came. What did Africans sing when freedom finally came? Dr. King quoted it, but African poets wrote it. Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we're free at last. Tell your children their story. Our story does not start in slavery. Our story has a 244-year-long chapter of chattel slavery, but our story has as its center a God who delivered us from slavery. The anonymous author, and I'm glad you quoted that, Pastor White, of the article about today's service, hiding behind the pseudonym of ADW staff, the Atlanta Daily Word staff. Did y'all read that article about today's service that you all are having here? I hope the anonymous reporter is in the house. Don't say nothing, just turn and look at your neighbor. Look and see if you look like him. You ought to read that article. The article said, he wrote these words, And he wrote these words from the vantage point of what my advisor, Dr. Charles Long, calls abysmal ignorance. He or she wrote, read it, it says, quote, "A controversy arose over Jeremiah Wright's sermons and Jeremiah Wright's so-called liberation theology," end quote. Brother reporter, sister reporter, anonymous reporter, my so-called black liberation theology comes from the lips and lives of the enslaved Africans who knew that the God of the European slaveholder was not the God of the enslaved African. The God of the Europeans who approved of slavery is not the God who delivered the enslaved Africans from slavery. That's black theology. God of the slave-holding framers of the Constitution in 1787 was not the God of Gabriel Prosser, Denmark Vesey, Jarena Lee, Harriet Tubman, Nat Turner, Marcus Garvey, Mary Helen Burroughs, or my grandmama. Our story has as the center, as the star of our story, the God who delivered us from slavery. Tell your children their story, and let confused journalists write whatever they want to write. Martin Luther King described it perfectly when he said, "Nothing in the world is more dangerous than sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity." This description sums up misinformed and uneducated journalists, but it also segues into my second point. Tell your children, number one, point one, tell your children their story. Number two, point two, tell your children the truth. Now, back to the text, the people in the text, the people in Genesis 6, the people who heard Moses, the people who were gathered east of the Jordan, in the land of the people of Moab. That's how Deuteronomy 1 describes them. They had not crossed the Jordan yet. They had not gotten where their story says God was leading them yet. They were at the end of their 40-year journey through the wilderness. And as the chronicler recounts the way over which they had come, the narrative does not avoid the truth. The narrative does not try to sugarcoat the truth. They had to tell their children the truth. Abraham lied on his wife, putting her in danger to protect his own hide. That's the truth. But God provided anyhow. Isaac was not the firstborn of Abraham. Ishmael, the African, born to an African mother, Isaac's mother. Hagar was given by Isaac's mama to her husband to be abused. Ishmael was made homeless as he and his mama were kicked out by a jealous wife who started that scandal. That's the truth. But God saw, God heard, and God gave us a preview of Olivia Pope as the fixer. Jacob was a rolling stone. That's the truth. Wherever he led, the man had 13 babies by 4 different women, all living together in the same condo. That's true. But God wrestled with him by the river Jabbok, and God gave him a new name, changed it from Jacob to Israel, gave him a new way of walking after he equipped him in the hill. Joseph, like us, was sold into slavery by